Welcome to Atrani, everybody. This is one of my favorite little towns on the Amalfi Coast. We left Positano. It's about a 1-hour drive to arrive here today. And as you can see behind me, this little town is beautiful. It's also a really cool place just to spend time. The restaurants are really good, the people are really nice, and the view, as you can see, is incredible. Now, it's a little cold this time of year, still nice and warm in the sun, but definitely not a good time for sunbathing. In the summertime, this is full of beachgoers. But again, now, during the off-season, we have this whole place to ourselves, so we can freely just explore and photograph anywhere we want. My main goal for this location is to capture a beautiful blue hour shot, but what I'm really hoping for is a clear sky like we have today, because I want to be able to capture star trails over the beautiful Twilight City. Now it's time to get into the lesson. As you can see, I'm already standing on the beach, and this time I'm going to be doing my scouting with my Fujifilm X-T2 and my 10-24. The reason being is I have a feeling I'm going to need a wider lens to capture all of these frames as reference. Now, I'm down here on the beach right now, but what I want to do is actually start with the top. So I'm going to hike up the stairs. There's a church way up on the mountain that has a beautiful view of this city looking down. So we're going to start up there, see what everything looks like, work our way down, and find the best vantage point to shoot from. The shot I'm looking to capture is of this side of the little city, and it's really beautiful. You can see the church, the dome, everything looks fantastic. But before we start climbing, I'm going to go over to that side, and I'm going to show you guys the view from that side looking this way. Now, I'm not going to lie, guys, I do have a little bit of inside information and a little secret that I'm going to reveal after we're done scouting. So here we are on the other side, looking back at where I was standing before. Let me go ahead and turn around, take a few reference shots so we can compare. Now, as you can see, it's nice. I mean, it's still a really pretty town. There's a little castle out to the left, but it doesn't have that same charm. And most importantly, that beautiful tile dome and church is not in the shot. So if you had to choose between those two sides, it's a no-brainer. We're definitely going with this one. There are quite a few angles and options for shooting this beautiful side of the city, but we're going to start at the top, the most difficult one to access, and see what it looks like with the view straight down. Here we are at the top. It's a beautiful little church and a great lookout point. It was actually a really nice walk. There were a lot of stairs. We walked through these little areas where people live, hanging their laundry, different things like that. It was really nice and quite different than Positano. Main difference was not nearly as many stairs and not as steep. We actually had nice areas where it flattened out and gave us a break for a little while. So being up here, it's nothing like being down at sea level. In fact, it looks like it could be almost a completely different town. Still worth coming up here to check out. What I'd say is this could be a good example of an alternative shot for this city too. If we get the main shot, the hero shot down there, close to the water, we could come up here and maybe get an additional shot as well. Let me go ahead and take a quick reference photo so we can take a look. First thing you're going to notice, horrible shadows, so you can't use a shot like this because of that shadow crawl. I'm also shooting with my wide angle lens, so this is equivalent in 35mm format at exactly 35. So if I was going to shoot this, I'd want to zoom in. I'd probably want to include a little bit of the horizon line and the water to give it that sense of scale and purpose so that you can see the mountain and where the water begins. I don't think it would look good if you zoomed all the way into the town, then it would be considered a telephoto or a detail shot. But if you were going to shoot this, I'd probably recommend a sunrise. You'd want to find the time when either the town is completely illuminated without any shadow disturbance at all, or wait till an early blue hour in the morning or a late blue hour at night. I think that you could use more of the city because it's likely a lot of it will actually light up at night and cause a very interesting composition. Another disappointing thing about being up here right now, we are out of season and they've covered a lot of the plants and citrus trees with these tarps. They're black and green, so that looks, well, pretty bad. So we'd want to shoot this at a completely different time, and I think with the trees actually being there, it would be nice framing with green, but with those tarps there, it's just not worth it. So that was a really nice walk up here. It's a really beautiful view, but let's go ahead and head back down and find the perfect shot. So here we are in the next location. We had to go back down quite a few stairs, and I'm still pretty far above the beach. Now, truth be told, this is not exactly where I wanted to go. It turns out that last time I was here, I found an access point just a little up these stairs and around the corner, but now they have a big private property sign, and I just walked up there, and there is a family getting ready to have dinner, so I'm pretty sure they wouldn't want us, the video crew and a photographer, messing up their nice dinner and sunset. So this is very close to the same view, so what I can do is I can take a quick reference shot of this and I can kind of show you what's going on. So I'm going to do that right now. Take a look at this reference shot. Immediately you can see the city looks really nice. We can see part of the beach. We have part of the road, the ocean, the mountain, clouds, and sky. It looks pretty good. The light has crept up to near top of the dome, so we're getting close to a sunset. But what you'll notice right away is on the left side of this frame, there's a big building in the way. If I climb up a little bit further, that building gets hidden and the view kind of opens up just a little bit more. So since I couldn't get to the spot I wanted to show you guys, how about I show you one of the old shots that I captured in 2012. Take a look at this. This is a late blue hour shot in the position I wanted to show you guys. It's really cool. We can see the buildings, we can see the church, we can see everything basically. It's framed beautifully. The only thing I don't like is see down in the lower left corner, I'm actually seeing somebody's potted plant and their terrace there. But even with that, it's still a really cool shot. Though if I have to be honest, I feel that I'm up just a little bit too high. I'd like to go down 20, 30 meters lower so I can be a little bit more eye level with the city itself. Another thing that's pretty cool about the shot I took in 2012 is that it was in the middle of August, so everybody was sunbathing. You can see that somebody meticulously placed all of those beach chairs in the perfect grid pattern. So you've seen in all the shots we've taken during the off season, nobody's crazy to winter sunbathe. So it's a completely different shot than it was before. I'd like to go down a little bit further so we can be pretty much a little bit more eye level and even with the city itself. Here's the next spot I wanted to show you guys a little bit further down and still quite a ways up above the beach line itself. Let me take a quick reference shot. Right off the bat, I like this shot even more. Main reason is because it opens up the city. Since we've come around the side of the town, it's spread out the buildings, so we see more buildings and you can see the wrap of the city itself. We also see the details of the beach and the water, and there's great leading lines all around. The only thing is, I'd still want to be up a little bit higher. So the last position I showed you guys was up a little bit higher, but it was too far over that way, so it foreshortened the city, whereas this spot, which is a little bit too low, spread it out. In fact, I think it'd be great if I could just be right up there. So here we are, it's the end of the day and we've arrived in my absolute favorite location to shoot Atrani, and now I can let you in on that little secret that I didn't tell you earlier. And the secret is, this is literally a few feet from my room. This is the balcony of this hotel. Oftentimes, the best view you can find is outside of a hotel window, on a balcony, or even on a hotel roof. So I don't usually shoot off of rooftops without an invitation or permission, but the best way to get access is to just book one of those hotels. They're usually really great to work with you. You just tell them, hey, I'm a photographer, the view's spectacular, can I really just access this location for a little while? 9 times out of 10, they're going to be totally cool with you because you are actually staying in the hotel. This all kind of comes down to doing the research on the shot. And I have a little bit of experience with this location already, so I kind of knew this spot would work. But going into these kind of projects, I look for either hotels that have special views, restaurants, and maybe bars, because a lot of those places will have a veranda or a terrace that you can shoot. And often those terraces are the best views of town because that's their whole marketing angle. The nice thing about that too is if they are very nice views, it's not hard to find them on the internet because they're advertising them as some of the nicest views in these towns. So chances are, if you're on booking.com and you have a bunch of tabs open with different hotels, just go through the photos and you'll find that they'll show the view. Now, if you've been on Google and you know that there's a popular view of these locations and you've seen it dozens of times on Google, be careful because sometimes those photos you actually see the one main photo of town that you know isn't the view. But if you start to see like here, a tree in the way or railing on a balcony. You know that it's not the same view. It's actually a private view. So I always look for that situation, and if you can find these locations, it makes it really easy. Now imagine just being able to shoot right outside of your window, beautiful seaside town, and not have to hike or scout anywhere. Well, that's great. And in this case, we're on a balcony, and it's really good because it's super cold. It might be 1 or 2 degrees over 0 degrees Celsius right now, so being close to the warmth of the room is a really nice thing to have. Probably the best thing about having a view like this from a hotel or a small balcony is the exclusivity. So think about this. We've already scouted a couple other locations, and they were pretty good. But if you have this view, you pretty much have it exclusive to yourself because you've booked the spot. Another nice thing is it might be really busy. If you come here in the peak of season, those photo spots, a little higher or lower or public, are probably going to be really busy. So it might be really difficult. You might have a lot of other people around, clamoring around to get that really beautiful shot. But here, you're going to have it all to yourself because guess what? You paid for it, you researched it, and you booked this spot to use on your own. Full disclosure, guys, I came to this town 5 years ago, and I shot at the other 2 access points that I showed you guys already. The one that's a little bit closer to the beach and a little bit higher up. I actually have 2 portfolio shots that I really liked. So going back into this project, I remembered, I was staring at this balcony. I remember really wanting to be this certain level and feeling like my shots were either too low or too high, but I couldn't climb out on this balcony, and it's clearly blocked and it says private. But I always remember, man, it would have been great to be up there, and I never was able to get up there. So when I started to look at Booking.com, that's what I use for a lot of my bookings, I saw this image. And I knew, based on my experience, where it was in the GPS coordinates, that it had to be at some level between those 2 spots that I already had in my portfolio. And when I found this place, I knew that's going to be the perfect elevation for the shot that I really want. All of the scouting, the different hotels, the knowing I wanted somewhere right in the middle of the 2 shots I already had, came down to the fact because I wanted to do something special with the shot that I always wanted to do before, and that was capture star trails. Now, obviously, there was no guarantee that we were going to get a clear blue sky for star trails, and there's still no guarantee. But even so, I knew that if I was going to sit outside in freezing temperatures, I wanted to be as close to the hotel as possible. So I thought, you know what, being a few feet from a warm, comfortable room and then letting my camera shoot for a few hours while I work on the computer or just hang out again in warmth, I knew that was going to be a win-win. And even if it wasn't clear, and even if these stars don't stack because of clouds or anything like that, I know that this is going to be the sunrise or sunset position that I want to shoot from anyway. So it was a total win. It's a really small town, and it was really easy to find. So I want you guys to think about that when you're booking things, and that also speaks a lot about booking something early. We're in the total off-season. This is the slowest month of the year here in Atrani and on the Amalfi Coast, so I pretty much had the selection of all the hotels that remained open for the winter season. But if you're going to come here in season, make sure that you look a month or 2 ahead of time. And don't be afraid to go on Booking.com and book things because you can cancel them. You can actually refund your money sometimes a week or even 48 hours in advance. So if you think you're going to be here, you think you want to come here, you found that view, block it out. That's what I do, so I know that I'm going to have it. Lee and Patrick were making fun of me literally 5 days before because nobody's here, except for us. But it's freezing, and you can understand it's not exactly a tropical beach paradise, but it's still beautiful, and there's nobody else here. Before I get into the settings and composition, you guys might notice camera looks a little bit different. So this is still the X-T2, but I put the battery grip on it. That's the main thing that's different. What this actually allows is the camera to use 3 different batteries. So there's 1 battery in the camera and 2 batteries in the grip. The reason I have that is I don't really want to sit out here all night, so I just want to press the shutter button, walk away from it, and know that my batteries aren't going to run out. So it's going to drain 1 battery, 2 batteries in the grip until it finally gets to the 3rd. So it gives me triple battery density to be able to shoot all night if I have to. Second thing, I have a standard trigger release. It's so standard that I bought it for $1.99 on eBay, and it came from Hong Kong. I have no idea what brand it is. All I needed it to be able to do is to have a button and have a button that slides and locks, because that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to set my exposures, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, and then I'm going to lock that button down, let it continuously shoot, and then I'm going to stay inside, toasty warm, and I'll come check on it later. Another advantage of 3 batteries is considering cold temperature operation. Thankfully, we're not below freezing, though it might feel like it right now in the wind, so the batteries are not going to deplete any faster. But if I was in Iceland or Norway or even the North Pole, I'd have to worry about the battery depletion, so this would be a good way to extend my battery life through the night. Now that brings up another interesting point about low operating temperature. I know I'm in Italy, so it doesn't really look like I'm in the Arctic right now, but it is still pretty cold. So you want to make sure that your gear is rated for the cold. Now thankfully, these Fujifilm cameras, they're rated for a few degrees below Celsius, which is a few degrees below freezing on Fahrenheit. I think somewhere between 15 and 20 degrees Fahrenheit and somewhere between 5 and 8 degrees under Celsius. This camera's fine. A lot of the Nikon and Canon gear that you have is going to be fine too, but definitely double check, because if it's not fine, you're going to notice that once you set your camera, a few minutes later, your battery will completely shut down. Let me talk a little bit about the composition here. To be honest, I'm completely stuck at 16 millimeter. That's what this lens captures. I wish I had something a little bit wider, somewhere between 12 and 14. I'd be able to capture more of the town and more of the water and more of the sky. But bearing in mind that I can't do that because 16 is my boundary, I did the best I could. Now here were the things that also conformed this composition. One, I knew that I wanted to potentially capture stars, so I wanted to have more sky than I had water or foreground. So I decided to go with a 60-40 split. Now I know sometimes when we're shooting stars, we want to have something like an 80% sky and a 20% foreground, or a 70-30 split, but in this case the town is really important too. So if I went up any higher, I'd make the town less important than the stars. So I didn't go 50-50, but 60-40 seemed good, where I still get a lot of sky in the upper right and a lot of town in the lower left, and they both seem important while still giving some extra emphasis on the sky above. The second thing is I have the edge of the mountain on the right of the frame. So I made sure to not crop that. I'm really picky about not cropping visual elements. There's a mountain way behind that too, but you can't actually register it to your eye. So I don't have to worry about cropping the mountain way behind, just the one that's visible, and that becomes a compositional element. That's fine too, because if I shifted a little bit more to the left, you guys can see that there is a white building. Take a look at this reference shot. This is shifted a little bit further to the left. That white building, I feel, is a real big eyesore. The nice buildings start just past that. So if I move just past that, I'm able to frame the mountain, a little bit of the water, and crop that. If you look at my final composition here, you can still see a little sliver of that white building, and you'll also notice that since I angled the camera up, I'm getting a little bit of distortion. That's fine. We can correct that in post, and once I do correct it, that white piece is going to completely disappear. Since this is the first time we're capturing stars together, I'm going to explain it from start to finish. The first thing that's very important is before I even worry about the stars, I need to capture the perfect blue hour. Now I'm going to be blending different exposures together. I'm going to blend the blue hour with my multiple stars stacked together. So that means I'm going to have to find a base frame of reference to use before I even add the stars in. So this is really nice. The light is starting to fall off, and we're entering an early blue hour, so I'm going to start shooting, and I'm going to wait, and I'm going to shoot all the way through the late blue hour before I start capturing stars. Now for this, since the sun set behind where I'm shooting, the background here, as you guys can see, there really aren't any clouds in the sky. It's really flat, so I can pretty much do this in a single exposure. Now, if you guys don't feel confident shooting in a single exposure to get everything right, feel free to shoot brackets. The most important thing is that the blue hour itself is captured correctly. For this blue hour shot, I'm going to use the standard settings with this camera, f8, I'm in aperture priority mode, and I have this trigger release cable here. So every few minutes, I'm going to go ahead and trigger this release until the blue hour is over. Now, it's important to point out that a lot can go wrong between now and getting an epic star trail shot. The first thing that can obviously go wrong is the stars look horrible. It's a little hazy. There could be blowing clouds. I have no idea what it's going to look like. Or there could be too much glow from the city. So worst case scenario, a clear blue sky with no stars or a partially blue sky with no stars is easy to make a selection out of. So what I could do with this shot, if I really like the composition, I had one night here, the stars didn't come out, I could put another sky in here. I could find a dramatic sky that I shot before, or I could shoot a sky in the next few days that's really nice at blue hour and put it right in. It's nice. I have a flat horizon, the mountain's easy to select, so I could still walk away with a pretty good shot. So even though my vision might be a star trail shot, I may not necessarily get it. And planning ahead for the possibility that I might not get it, I know that I could still make a nice portfolio shot out of this image. So right now I'm in aperture priority mode. I'm shooting at f8. It's a single exposure at the lowest ISO my camera can handle. And I'm getting about 1.3, 1.5 seconds per exposure. And that means it's starting to get dark outside. In a few minutes, maybe 15 more, 20 more minutes, I'm probably going to have an exposure time of 10 seconds, 12 seconds. Now, as soon as it gets full dark outside, that exposure is probably going to slip into 25 or 30 seconds, something like that. It really depends on the amount of ambient light in the city, and I haven't seen it yet. Once I shoot through the blue hour, and if there are no clouds in the sky, it'll be time to transition into capturing stars. Now, the last time I was here, it was 5 years ago. I wasn't shooting astrophotography, so I didn't really pay attention to the stars. I don't even remember if there was a clear night. I was just focusing on blue hour sunrises and sunsets. So I'm not really sure what the effect of all the lights in the town are going to have on the frame. Generally speaking, if we're in a zero dark sky, that means we're in a dark sky reserve, for example, in New Zealand or somewhere else in the world, our settings are going to be pretty standard when there's no light around. We're going to have to shoot at our fastest aperture, if that's f2.8, f2.2, f1.8, and we're probably going to have to shoot a 30-second exposure at ISO 1600 to 3200 to be able to capture the stars. Well, the issue is, it's never going to get fully dark here because we're in a little city, there's cities surrounding us, we're in a very big metropolitan area of the world. So we have to register what actually Italy dark is going to be, or what Atrani dark is going to be. Once we figure out how dark it's going to get, how bad or impactful the lights from the town are, then we can assess what settings we use. So the light's starting to look really good. I'm going to shoot all the way through blue hour, and we're going to wait a little bit longer until it gets full dark out, and then we're going to know it's dark because we're also going to see stars. This panel light's going to look crazy, and we're going to hopefully see stars. And at that point, I'll be able to test the camera settings, figure out what's going to work, what's not going to work, and whether, to be honest, this shot is going to work at all. I've already let you in on the secret that I do most of my scouting with the iPhone, but goes past that. I do a lot of my calculation for stars and astrophotography as well. The application I use to calculate star trails and how they're going to look in the frame is called PhotoPills. Once you get inside of PhotoPills, it's pretty easy. All you have to do is click on Night AR, and that means Night Augmented Reality. It's going to tell me that I need to update my iOS just like Apple always does, but I'm going to tell it okay, I'll do it later. And you can see, as I move around the town, you can see exactly, that's true north. And you see those little orbs moving around, that's actually the stars themselves. So I know that if I frame up close to the same shot, that's the way the stars are going to move through the scene. I'm going to get these nice circling lines across the image. And this is really cool because you can literally just put this right over your camera and say my camera was rotated over here, this was my shot. I could see exactly where that center of rotation was going to be in my frame. In this case, if the center of rotation was that high, I may need to adjust it so it stays in the frame. I could do something really cool. So all of those shots, you see that really cool center of rotation perfectly placed in the composition. This app allows you to plan that during the day and know exactly how your star trails are going to look. Well, right now, it's important to point out that I am locked down to this composition. I really like the way the town looks, and that's my composition. I'll be happy with any stars in the frame. But if I had a lot of different options for this, different compositions that I could use for this town, I could have scouted earlier, changed my composition so that it would complement the ways the stars rotate, or even maybe have the center, the North Pole rotation in my frame. But in this case, I'll take the stars however they are for this composition. The blue hour is almost over, but it's not quite full dark yet. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to head into my room where it's nice and warm. I'm going to let the camera stay in its interval shooting mode, and I'm going to come back in about 20 minutes and see if there's any stars in the sky. What's interesting is, before I went back to my room, I left my camera shooting in interval timer mode. So I actually have the progression of the end of blue hour all the way till full dark. Let's take a look at that right now. So as you can see, it's already pretty dark outside, and as that blue light starts to fade, we get to a full black sky. Now the nice thing about having that progression recorded into your camera, if you're not sure, because it can be very difficult sometimes to tell, especially when there's city lights, if it's actually full dark, is to play back through your frames. If you start to see all that light disappear, you're going to see it change from blue to dark blue all the way to black, and once it stops changing, you know that you've reached the peak of darkness. Now that it can't get any more dark, or it's Atrani dark right now, we need to tweak the settings. The first thing I want to do is pop my camera into manual mode and simulate what I was shooting in the interval timer. Inside of manual mode here, I'm now simulating what I was shooting in aperture priority mode by using manual and setting it to f8, 30 seconds, and this is set to ISO 100. Let's take a look at what this captures. Looking at this shot, you can see the city isn't even exposed correctly. We can see the hot lights. We can't see much of the town at all. And the sky and everything around the edges of the town are just a black mess. So this wouldn't work even if you were trying to use a single exposure. At this point, I've already captured the city. I have every version of Blue Hour to work with. Now let's go ahead and change some of the settings. I'm going to leave everything the same. I'm just going to modify the f-stop. I'm going to take it from f8 to f4 and see if the scene improves. Taking a look at this frame, you can actually start to see some of the glow in the sky. Near the edges of the town and the mountain, you can actually see some of that light accumulation that's happening from the town and spilling into the sky. With it zoomed all the way out here, you can also see that there are a few visible stars on the right side of the frame. Now I'm going to be completely honest. If we were in a remote landscape or a perfectly dark sky reserve, we'd see every star in the sky and it would be much easier to capture. But to be honest, this is never going to look like it would in nature in a dark sky reserve, because when you have a bunch of lights from the city, you don't see as many stars. Many of you guys might live in cities and you don't see any stars. If you live in New York City, for example, and you see a starry sky, something's probably wrong because all the power's out. So in a town like this, while it's certainly possible to get some stars, it's never going to look exactly like a zero dark landscape. Bearing in mind that we're not going to have a sky populated with millions of stars, we can still get something really nice, but we have to get these settings right. So let's take a look at the scene. Again, you can see that the town is really blown out, but we can kind of see a few stars in the sky, and we can also see a little bit of light accumulation in that sky itself. So what I need to do at this point is we need to zoom in and see how many stars we can count with this exposure. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this shot. What you guys can do is just go into your image review mode on the back of the camera. Be careful not to move or disturb the camera's position while you do this. Zoom in as far as you can and start looking around the sky. So where I couldn't see anything before, as I start to pan around here, especially towards the edge, I'm starting to notice there are in fact some stars in the sky. Now obviously there's a lot of light coming from that town, but it's not just the light from the town that I'm worried about. It's light from the passing cars or people with iPhone lights or anything like that. Basically any light that can enter the front of my camera and potentially destroy one of the frames in the sequence I'm trying to capture. In a situation like this, in order to block the light, we could simply just put our hand in front and take the shot. But since I'm going to leave this camera shooting throughout the night to capture the stars so that we can stack them and create star trails later, I'm not going to stand here for hours with my hands in front of the frame. So I'm going to use a different solution. So just like duct tape can fix anything, gaffer tape can fix some things for photographers. So what I actually have here is just 2 small rolls of gaffer tape. I've actually taken them and wrapped them around a part of a pen just so I don't have to carry a giant roll of tape with me. And what I'm going to do is just take a few pieces of tape, and just like I would have covered the front of the lens with my hand, I'm just going to gently add tape to the parts of the image that have the blown out town on the lower left. Now bear in mind, I could potentially knock my camera or move it a little bit, and if I do that, I have the potential of destroying this entire shot. So I'm going to be very, very careful and really apply this tape as carefully as possible. Probably also important to point out that I have a lens hood on my camera, so if you guys were thinking I was just going to tape up the front of my lens, it's probably better to do it on the lens hood. Still, it'll require a little bit more tape than the lens itself, but the lens hood itself also provides additional protection surrounding the front of the lens. So again, this is as simple as blocking out portions of the shot. And what I want to make sure that I don't do is cover up the sky. Very carefully just wrap this around here. And keep in mind, you guys see this down here is lit. That's because the big video light is on me right now, which honestly is a perfect example of why I'm doing this in the first place. But as soon as that light goes off, you're going to see that this is just blacked out on the bottom. And you have to make sure, don't accidentally put tape in the sky. It's the sky that we're concerned with keeping. We're just trying to tape off the bottom. So that's one piece. It's probably going to take 2 more pieces to get the job done. Now that the tape was successfully applied to the camera without disturbing the camera, let's take a look at the 2 frames together. Keep in mind that when you're out here at night looking at the back of your camera, it may be hard to tell a difference between the frames, but what I suggest doing is flipping back and forth between them quickly. And let's do that right now on screen. I don't know if you guys noticed that, but this frame with the tape, right around the edge of the mountain, there's actually less glow from the lights in the sky. So is it a huge difference, a groundbreaking difference? No, but it's 10 to 20% better, and that makes a huge difference in post-processing because we have more contrast in the sky, less light disturbing the sky from the city, which means we have a greater chance of seeing those stars without that light. The first thing I want to point out is that even though the sky is clear right now and the forecast says it's going to be clear for a couple hours, there is no guarantee. Now I'm hoping if I get this started soon, I can get a series of exposures that are going to work perfectly. The second thing I really want to point out is that this is not just a busy place with people. There are a bunch of planes flying over us right now too. So I have a feeling when we get this into post-processing, we put all this back together, we're going to see those beautiful trails of the stars, and we're also going to see all of the airline routes as well. So in astrophotography, I think the trails look good. I don't necessarily think that the trails from airplanes look good, so we'll see how many planes we end up with, and we'll take care of them in post-processing. All that's left to do is to start capturing a series of 30-second exposures, and to do that, I'm going to use the trigger release. I'm just going to press the button when I'm ready and lock it, and it's going to take consecutive 30-second exposures until I decide it's going to stop. I want you guys to bear in mind, though, that the X-T2 and a lot of the Fujifilm cameras allow you to shoot an infinite number of frames, meaning that when I lock down the shutter, the only thing that's going to stop it is a memory card being full or a battery that's going to die. Those are the only things that are going to stop this from shooting. Some cameras that I've used by Nikon, for example, will limit you to 100 consecutive shots using a trigger release. This can be really frustrating because you want to shoot sometimes 200 or 300 and take the best portion for your star trails. So make sure you check the manual for your specific camera and assure that you can take more than 100 consecutive shots. The second thing I want to point out is that I am using a trigger release cable. But you guys have already seen me use the interval timer shooting. So why am I not using interval timer shooting to capture the stars? There's one main reason. In order to use interval timer shooting, you have to set an interval. And the lowest interval you can set is 1 second. Now 1 second doesn't seem like a lot of time, but in astrophotography, when you're stacking star trails together, believe it or not, you'll start to see that 1 second register as a gap between each capture of stars. So it's very important that you have little to no space between each exposure. So this camera basically takes them back to back to back to back. And as long as I lock this down, there's not going to be any space between those. So please keep that in mind. Now, if you do not have a shutter release cable, then obviously you want to use interval timer, or else you're going to have to find something to push down the camera button. What you can do, and what I've actually had to do in a bind, because these things, especially like me, if you buy them $2 airship from Hong Kong, they do tend to break. And if they do break, and you don't want to use the interval timer and you want everything to be perfect, what you can actually do is find a stone or a pebble on the ground, and you can actually spam the button with the pebble and take another piece of gaffer tape and tape it down to lock that button down. So any way to do that. I know it sounds like a funny thing to have to do, but when gear does fail, you have to be a little creative in the field to get it right. All that's left to do is lock that button down and shoot a series of exposures. But before I do that, and especially since I've been talking to you guys for a while, I'm going to take one more test frame. The best thing you can do before you start a sequence that's long like this is test it. Double check it, triple check it. If you have to, make sure everything is right and you didn't accidentally adjust something that you shouldn't have. So I'm going to do that one more time before I get everything going. Final test shot looks perfect. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go ahead and press this and lock it. I'll do that right now. Lock that down. We're going to shut off this very bright panel light. I'm going to let this cook for probably about 2 hours, and we're going to take a look at all these frames in post-processing. Welcome back to the post-processing studio, everybody. You just saw the in-the-field portion of Atrani when I was capturing star trails over that beautiful little village. And I have to admit, I'm really excited about this because it's the first time that I'm going to be able to teach you guys how to do star trails over a city or a town. Previously in Photographing the World, we've done star trails, we've done Milky Way, we've done astrophotography, but it's always been in a dark sky reserve. So a lot of people think that you can't do star trails over towns or cities. But if it's a small village like this, like Atrani or on the Amalfi Coast, chances are you can. Now, while the stars certainly aren't going to be as magnificent as if you were in a dark sky reserve and there were no ambient lights around, they're still going to be pretty predominant in the frame. And you'll see as I start to put this together, they may not be as intense, but that also helps them not distract from the background itself. I'm also not going to lie to you guys, this might be one of the most complicated shots we've done in Photographing the World so far. So let's dive right in and get started. Let's take a look at my actual Lightroom catalog where I have all of these star layers so I can show you how I exported these and how everything was put together. So here inside of Lightroom, there are, well, let's just say it, hundreds of shots. Now remember, I was shooting for the balcony, so that was actually really convenient. What I didn't really share with you guys is it was super windy too, so I was worried, actually. There was a 50-50 chance that this shot wasn't going to work out, so I'm excited that it actually worked out. So what we covered so far, and if you see this, we have early blue hour. You can see that the lights are starting to turn on here, and then if I go all the way through, you can just see as I cycle through on the bottom there that we're really getting into the late blue hour, mid blue hour here, even later, and then full dark. Now I've went ahead and flagged the ones that I think are going to work, and I'm going to come back to that and explain that in just a few minutes. Now this is the late blue hour, but what I really want to cover here is the stars themselves. So if you guys remember, after I did a bunch of tests, we actually came back with some gaffer's tape, and that was the gaffer tape. That's the gaffer tape with the studio lighting, that panel lighting they were using to illuminate me for the shot, and then after they turned it off, it looked like this. After a few more tests, I locked down all my settings, I got it exactly the way I wanted, and it was f4, 30 seconds at ISO 100. So if I go ahead and scroll here, actually if I select this first one, I'm going to scroll all the way to the end of my shooting. Remember, I shot until the batteries died themselves. I'm going to hold Shift and click, and I have 360 photos. So you can see there are 360 selected. Now that is a lot. That's a lot of layers to deal with, a lot of stars, and that's going to produce some very long star trails. So let's examine what these shots look like straight out of camera, and that's this one right here. You can see it's pretty dark, but if I zoom in, there are some stars there, and as soon as this redraw happens here and Lightroom refreshes, we'll actually see that there are some stars. So my hope was, as I looked at the back of the LCD, that this would stack up and there'd actually be more stars would appear later, and as it kind of moved through the sky, that these would stack up really nice. Now this is straight out of camera. Let me go ahead and back this up. I want to explain a few things that I've done. Now, we've already covered a lot of these tools already. We've done the exposure, contrast, highlight, shadows, different things like that. We've also done the selective adjustments. We've done the gradient tool, elliptical tool, all of those things. So I just want to walk you through everything I've done to prep the stars. Now, what I decided to do was to underexpose this shot and add the gaffer tape to be able to get as much of the sky as possible. Now, that's because when we build the star stacks, if you remember from Photographing the World 2, we want to be careful because anything that is 50% gray and above, in other words, 50% gray to white, is going to basically be in the shot. So all of them are going to, all these stars that way, they're just going to stack up because they're bright objects. Everything that's 50% gray and below is supposed to disappear. So this glow on the horizon, for example, I want to make sure that that's not too bright. If that's too bright, then that's going to stack up as well. So I don't want any of that to happen. If I were to overexpose too much, I'd get a glow from the town. And if that glow from the town becomes too intense, then that as well is going to stack up and kind of make it more difficult for me to composite clean star trails. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to increase the intensity of the sky without increasing the intensity of the rest of the scene. So before I did that, though, the other thing I forgot to do while I was in the field was lock down my white balance. Now, I admit I made a little bit of a mistake, but in Lightroom it doesn't really matter. What I did first, the first thing, is just locked a cool white balance to one of these scenes. So I changed it from default in camera, and they vary just slightly a little bit in between each shot. I just selected a cool 3200 and a plus 20 tint, and it looks just like this. The next thing I actually did, if we go from here to here, you'll see that I brightened up the sky. Now let me just show you what I did. Notice nothing's changed here. All I did was I created a gradient, just like I created any other gradient, right from the sky. And you can see as I hover over this, you'll see what was selected. And I just tweaked a few things. I brought the exposure up, I brought the highlights up, and the whites. And you can see as I did that, let me just go ahead and zero these out really quick. As I did that, you can see that it's bringing the mountain up and the stars. So what I'm not really trying to do is I don't want to brighten those bright stars. They're already pretty intense. What I'm trying to do is pull out a lot of detail from the muted stars. And that's what I've done with this gradient right here. And the problem is that also illuminated this mountain. Not only that, it also accentuated its sort of a green color. Because remember I locked the white balance? I really don't like the way that looks. So what I did after I created this gradient, I took it one step further and I neutralized that color. So with this gradient, you can see that I also added an elliptical gradient here. And just to walk you through that, same thing as the last time. You can see any elliptical gradient that we've used so far. It basically just selects this area. And to offset what I did there when I overexposed this mountain, I actually just pulled the exposure down just a little bit, and also the highlights. You can see how much I pulled those highlights down just to compensate. That way, when I stack this on top, it's not going to be super intense and vivid. It's going to make it easier to composite. The other thing I also did was change that tint. I felt that it was a little too green, and you can see that that's very green. But when I brought the tint up, it made it look really nice. And it basically translated into something that looks like this. And as soon as that loads, I'll close that down. Basically looks just like this. So from straight out of camera to something like this. So you can see the difference. Locked white balance, brighter sky without adjusting the shadows, and then just muting down the mountain. The next step was to take all of these, every single one of these. I'm just going to zoom all the way over to here. I have my selection points marked with colors again. Right click, export, and the export settings for this are actually going to be, believe it or not, JPEG. So full-size JPEGs, and I'm just going to go ahead and do Pro Photo, full quality. And I want to make sure that I don't open these in Photoshop. But basically, I'm going to export these as JPEGs. So 360 JPEGs that are then going to get stacked together. Now, you might be asking yourself, since when does he use JPEG files and edit JPEG files? Well, this is 360 24 megapixel files, basically. So if you have a supercomputer at home, or you have, I don't know, anything that's more powerful than, let's say, my MacBook Pro, you could probably get away with TIFFs. But just keep in mind, these JPEGs are going to be around 4 to 5 megs. A TIFF file is going to be anywhere from 30 to 70 megs. And when you stack all of those together in Photoshop, it would just cause a laptop to crash. So try TIFFs if you want. JPEGs have always worked well for me. And believe it or not, most of it's just going to disappear, and we're not going to manipulate it that much afterwards. It's just going to become one layer in the stack and in the composite. So JPEGs are pretty cool. So 360 is kind of a random number when it comes to star trails, and I want to create a tail fade. So let's go ahead and jump right into Photoshop and let's take a look at what 360 stacked exposures actually looks like. So here we go. This is the result of the stacking itself. I'm going to walk you guys through this process step by step, but first I just want to show you how this came out. So you can see 360 stars. Some you can see towards the center of the rotation here, a very short line, but here towards the edge of the rotation, they actually streaked all the way across the sky. So that looks actually pretty good. Let me walk you guys through how to actually do this. Now, the process is something like this. First thing, after you export all of those files, and you have them in a folder, go to File, Scripts, Load Files into Stack. Now I've included 36 files for you guys to bring in. So just go to the Photographing the World, go to Lesson 3, and then you'll see this folder called 36 Star Layers. Select that folder, select all the images, open them. Don't try to do anything like automatically align or create a smart object, and just say OK. After a little bit of time, Photoshop will bring all these in as layers. All right, that was actually pretty quick, but this is only 36 layers, and we have 360. Now, the reason I wanted to use 36 was actually so that I could show you how these tail fades actually work. Let me just go ahead and break the palette out here just so we can see all these layers. So I'm going to select all of these, just shift select all the way to the top and bottom here, and I'm going to change this to the lighten blending mode. And just like that, you can see that these stars pop right in. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit here. Now, here's why I brought in 36. Previously in Photographing the World, I was using 100 layers. So let's just say, for demonstration purposes, that I have 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 layers. Well, if I wanted to create what's called a tail fade, first thing I do is figure out which one's the start, which is that one right there, and which one's the finish, which is this one right here. And I'd leave this one at 100 opacity, and then I take them down. 90, so I can just hit 9 on the keyboard. 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, and 10. So you can see now I've created these little comments. Well, that's easy when you have 10 layers or 100 layers, because you can just go 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, or 100, 99, 98, 97, 96. It's pretty easy. But what happens when you have a random amount? What if I had 352 or 362 or like I have now 360? Well, it's actually pretty easy, and I wanted to walk you guys through that. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn these all back to full opacity, and I'm going to turn all of these layers back on. Now, what I actually did was something a little bit different. Since I had 360, I left the first 60 at 100%. So this is 36. So we're just dropping the decimal point. Let's take the first 6, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And what I'm actually going to do is color these, just so I know. These are the first 6 as green. So these are going to be 100% opacity. I decided to just make these green just as a reference, just in case I want to change something later. These are going to stay at full opacity. They're going to be the bottom of the comment. The next thing, that leaves me with 30 layers. So the next 3 are also going to stay at 100% opacity. I'll make that yellow. So I know that all of these are 100. The next 3 are actually going to be 90. Next 3 are going to be 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, scroll down, 30, 20, one more, 10. So those final 3 selected, let me just go ahead and put the layers palette back in here just to get it out of the way so we can take a look at the result here. And if I pan around, you can see that now I actually have quite a few stars, and I have what's called the tail fade. Now obviously, tail fade is a style choice, completely up to you if you want to have these comments or you want just streaks without any fading from top to bottom. That is totally a style choice. So that's the result of the 36 layers with this technique of leaving the lead images at 100% and then just grabbing a bulk of images and changing it. In order to do that with the 360, I had to wait a lot of time to import that, but I took the first 60 and I selected those. Those stayed 100%. The next 3 stayed 100%, and then the next 3 went 99, the next 3 98, the next 3 97. That process itself took quite a bit of time, but in the end, this is the result that I ended up with. Now from there, it was a little bit interesting because you can see all of these little details here. See all these details that we're getting? Now, I don't know if this is a plane. Some of these things here are airplanes. Some of these things are, it could be the International Space Station occasionally that goes by, satellites, basically anything that catches light. Even if a seagull is flying and it catches a spotlight, it can actually leave one of these issues. So you can see they're all over the place. So this requires a massive amount of cleanup. So the first thing that I did is I actually went through and changed it to a tail fade, and that basically took it from this to this. So not a dramatic difference, but you can see that now we're starting to get those fades and everything's softening out a little bit. From there, it did reduce some of these issues because some of it actually faded. You can see that some of it does go away. Like that one up there thankfully did go away. And there's still a lot of stuff to get rid of. Now again, I'm not going to lie, there is not a automatic process for removing streaks or removing planes from your star trails. And if you are going to shoot in urban environments or small towns in Italy, chances are there's going to be an airport nearby. Napoli Airport's not far from the Amalfi Coast, so airplanes are definitely going to go by. So the process to remove this is actually a manual one, and I just kind of want to walk you guys through the basics of that really quickly. So I'm just going to create a new layer, and to get rid of these things, like here, for example, something like this, if I zoom in, this is really easy, right? Anything like that, it's just like a spot on the sky, we can go ahead and remove it. Just click and remove it. So you can first hunt and seek out and destroy these little things. I have no idea what that was. Maybe it's a UFO. Who knows? I doubt it. But it could be. But I can get rid of these very easily. Like these are small ones. You know, they're away from any lines. But what happens if I have stuff that's intersecting these stars? If I pan all the way over here, see this intersection? If I start to do this, it's going to do an okay job sometimes, but it's not going to do an okay job every time. And you can see that it's starting to move those stars, and it's just not looking like a professional result. So the way that you have to do this, or the best way I would recommend doing it, is actually manually. So using a low flow and the clone stamp, you can actually go in and select this, and believe it or not, start painting all these things out manually. Piece by piece, piece by piece. Now you can go a little ways without resetting the clone stamp, but eventually these are going to be off. But for the most part, you can do a better job, and you can see that before and after. Just go in and paint. Now, it's important that you decide whether or not you want to keep the solid star trails or the tail fades first, because this process takes quite a bit of time. We can also see these here, these dots, same thing. Find a star line right here, match it, and then just paint it out. Piece by piece, step by step. And in the end, all of these things will be removed with this process, and the final result should look like this. So you can see everything's disappeared. Now, I could walk you through this entire process. It actually would take me about an hour to paint out all of these tiny little stars with all of these little things that streaked across the sky. But rather than make you guys suffer through an hour of me talking while I move the clone stamp back and forth, we're just going to speed up through the entire process. Well, that was fun. Now let's move on. Okay, so we're going to just put this to the side for now. These are the stars stacked. Let's go ahead and also close this in the background. These are the stars that we used for the example. And let's go back to Lightroom itself. Now, the selection process was pretty interesting, and I'm going to show examples of this when we're in Photoshop. But essentially, those stars look so great stacked. If we take a look at these again in Photoshop, they look so great because they're over a dark sky. And when I use lighten, it's basically over the darkest portion of the night. This is as dark as it got over Atrani, and you can see that we still have some ambient light in the sky. So if I took this and let's say I use the lighten blending mode to bring these star trails into a scene over something like, let's find an early blue hour, something like this that's bright, I'm not going to be able to see any of those stars in the sky. So the best thing that you can do if you want to blend is find a acceptable late blue hour shot. So what I did is I went through and I was looking for a couple key things, and I made some flags here, the ones that I used, and just like the other color coordination I used, actually yellow is things that I was thinking of, and actually these green ones are the ones that I actually chose. And we're going to walk through the settings here. But the reason that I actually chose this one, this underexposed, is because the sky looks beautiful. I think it's dark enough. And I had a continuous car trail almost all the way around here. Randomly throughout here, actually, as I went through, I had some car trails or some cars stopped and some things moving. But since I had the interval timer setting for a while, I was able to just go ahead and choose the one that I thought was the most acceptable. The other thing I wanted to do was select an earlier blue hour to work with. So check out here, like for example, look down here. See how blown out and yellow those highlights are? If we go just a little bit back in time, maybe 10 minutes, you can see that that cleans up. So you see how now that light isn't pooling, that intense yellow isn't pooling. So what I want to do is sort of create a combination of a blue hour, similar to what we did in the last lesson using exposure blending, but this time I'm actually just going to use single exposures from multiple points in blue hour. And it's going to be a really easy process. But what I did is I actually exported these raw files that we're going to use. So what I'm going to do now is go into the project itself, and that's inside of Lesson 3, Italy Atrani stars, and I'm going to load the Lightroom catalog associated with it. Here we are in the project file of Lightroom, and it's an amazing feeling when you can call hundreds of files into four. There are 4 raw files. You can see here's our early blue hour, our late blue hour, and I have the median exposure, straight out of camera metered, overexposure, and the underexposure. Unlike the previous lesson in Blue Hour, where I brought in one layer and then corrected the highlights, this time I'm actually going to bring in something that's underexposed, and then I'm going to bring in a corrected shadows version. Now the reason is I want to try to maintain this color in the sky. I think that this is the perfect blue to be able to blend in those stars. So the first thing I'm going to do is identify that I am going to make adjustments into the underexposed image. Now, the other reason is these highlights already, they're out of control even in the underexposed. I know that even if I go to the regular exposure, these highlights are gone. Like there is no way I can get those. There's no way I can get these highlights, so I have to use these files. Now with this selected, I'm just going to make some basic edits. First thing, let's bring up the exposure just a little bit. Let's say about 0.5. Let's say half a stop. Next thing, let's bring up the shadows. Let's just say an even 50. Let's also do the blacks here. Just about another even 50. I like using these even numbers. They're easy to remember. So in the same thing, let's go ahead and pull the highlights down. And we'll also say something around 50. Yeah, actually, 50 looks perfect. Negative 50. All right, cool. So we've just adjusted this really quick. We've maintained a pretty nice and dark sky. This should look pretty good. Let's go ahead and get this into Photoshop really quick. But before I do that, let me just point one thing out. I'm leaving the sharpening intact, but I'm not doing any noise reduction. Now I left this across the board, and the reason I did is I didn't want any noise reduction in the star layers themselves, and I'm banking on the fact that all of this is going to line up perfectly and overlay perfectly over top of each underlying layer, so I don't want any discrepancies. So since I left the noise reduction off on the stars, because I don't want any of the stars to be removed, I'm going to leave it off on this as well. The other thing you might notice is this is very distorted. You can see that these lines are distorted as well. Well, I could go in and manually change it here in the transform, or even use the upright transform tool. But anytime I'm dealing with stacking hundreds of layers, especially stars, I don't want to do this process yet. I want to do it at the end just in case I forgot something, just in case one of these algorithms is off, just in case I hit auto and when I copy it, one is off. If one star layer, if one little thing differs in position, in scale, in transform, when you put it all together, one star will be off. It'll ruin the entire thing. Now that the basic adjustments are set, we need to darken the sky, and I'm going to do that by creating a gradient, just like this. Now, it's set to an exposure here at 1. Let's actually set this to -1. And let's go even further. Let's say -1.5. Something really dark. Now, here's the thing. This is what you have to decide here. This is that horizon. Let's say we'll call that the low glow of the horizon. Now, as those stars start to blend in, they're going to fade out on that horizon. But as I move this down also, you can see that it's darkening my foreground. So I have to kind of decide how I want this to fade and how I want this glow on the horizon to work. So in my opinion, I don't want a whole lot of glow on the horizon, so I'm just going to go ahead and make this fairly dark, just like that. So we're going to leave it like that. We're going to go ahead and close this out. Now let's bring this into Photoshop. Let's go ahead and say export and make sure the settings there are intact. Export, yes, to the temp folder, PSD, correct, PSD ProPhoto 16-bit, 300 dpi, open in Photoshop, export. All right, one down, let's go back to Lightroom. Now instead of using the normal exposure like I did before in the previous lesson, I'm actually going to use the overexposure. The reason being, I want the detail in the mountain, more specifically the luminosity in the mountain, and this one actually is exposed mostly correct. Since I have the highlights controlled and the other layer is already really dark, I'm just concerned about this area and a few other ones, so let's just make some small adjustments. Let's bring the exposure down just a little bit. Let's say -0.5. That looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and crank those highlights all the way down because we're not even going to use them. And let's bring the shadows up. I'm just going to give it an even 50 just like last time. That looked pretty good. And another even 50 so we can kind of color match it. And if you look at these, this one's a lot darker because of that gradient, but this one, it is pretty close. So we've already taken this one into Photoshop. Let's go ahead and export this, export it with the same settings with previous. Command A for select all, Command C for copy, and we'll close that, paste it on top. Now before I get into the blending, let's go ahead and bring the stars in as well. I'm going to bring the final one in that I spent all that time editing, so I'm going to go ahead and copy this, leave it open just in case we want to refer back to it, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it in. Now, star stacking 101. Shoot a bunch of 30-second exposures consecutively. Star stacking 102, take them all into Photoshop, use the light and blending mode. Get a little bit more complicated when we start to bring this into the original exposure, like the late blue hour, for example. Now, let's go ahead and do the same thing. Let's take these star layers and click on lighten. Now, if I really wanted to use the blue hour of my choice, this would probably be the blue hour. But as you can see, I can hardly see any of those stars. And the reason being is that sky is too bright. And realistically, you wouldn't be able to see stars in the sky like that. But if we turn this off and look at the layer below, now we're talking. You can actually see these stars. And a good way that you can tell you're on the right track to the right illumination in the sky to be able to use star trails is to toggle the stars from lighten to normal. So you can see just that difference here. For example, right here you can see now that horizon changes. Remember I was saying inside a Lightroom, how we use that gradient is going to determine how these fade into the horizon. But it looks pretty good. The nice thing is when we use it from lighten as opposed to normal, we're able to just throw it right on top of the image itself. And you can see it's illuminating some of the town here, it's illuminating some of the mountain, but we'll address that shortly. The first thing we need to do is build the best possible base plate for this. And in order to do that, the first thing we have to do is combine these two exposures. Now this is interesting because before I was using another exposure and I was creating a luminosity mask just for the highlights, but this time we're going to work specifically in the shadows. Reason being is I want to control the mountain here, but I also can't change the sky because if I accidentally brighten the sky, which is also a shadow, guess what? That's going to be a problem because my stars are just not going to come through. They're going to look like this. So we're going to have to do something a little bit different. Let's go ahead and go into the channels here. Now, we've already done a few things. We've created luminosity masks, we've created channel masks, so we're going to go ahead and create a luminosity mask for the shadows. So if I command click the RGB channel and create a new mask, you can see, and I'm going to go ahead and deselect, that this is basically a selection for the highlights. So remember, all I have to do is invert it, Command I. If I invert that, now it's going to be a selection for the shadows. So right off the bat, if I wanted to do a simple blend and bring the shadows in, I could use this as a mask. But I want to go ahead and clamp it down. Now before, we were using clamping with curves, Command M for curves. And remember how I was clamping this down like this so that I could remove more of the highlights? Well, there's another way to do it, and it's actually called the intersect selection method. But before I go into that, let me just explain it really quick so everybody's on the same page. If I have a new channel, for example, and I'm just going to use a regular marquee, I can create one. There's a regular mask. And if I hold Shift, I can add to this mask. If I hold Option, I can subtract from it, just like that, and I can subtract. That's basically what we're doing here when we hold Command or Command Option or Command Shift. We're adding, subtracting. But we also have another one, and that's Shift, Command, Option, and that is actually intersect. So let me start this over real quick. I'll deselect, and let's say that I have a square. If I change this to a circle, and I hold Shift and Option, you can see that I get that little asterisk. Well, that's going to intersect, and intersect basically does this. It'll actually intersect and it'll create a compound mask based on those selections, based on those intersection points. So that's pretty simple, but it does something really interesting when you do it on these luminosity masks. So right now we could call this shadows, and we're going to call it shadows 1. But if I load this as a selection, you can see just command clicking it, crawling ants, and then I go over here and I hold Command, Option, and Shift. See how I get that little X? I'm going to go ahead and intersect its own selection. So with it selected, I'm going to intersect select it, just like that, and I'm going to create a new mask. And you can see that this one is going to be darker, almost like I clamped it. So this is actually a cleaner way of doing things. Now, for most intents, most purposes, you can get away with clamping because it's really fast. When you want a really precise control, you can actually use the intersect method. So I can name this one Shadows 2, and I can do it again. Command click, intersect, create new mask. I can do it again. Command click, intersect, and create a new mask. And you can see that I'm going to get more and more isolated. Shadows 1, Shadows 2, Shadows 3, and Shadows 4. I definitely don't need the Shadows 4, so let's just go ahead and keep the 3 for now, and I'm just going to go ahead and name those. It's good to name these. If you have a million channels, they get really hard to tell what's going on. So I'm actually going to use Shadows 2. So we're going to load Shadows 2, click on RGB, go to Layers, and what I'm going to do is create a new folder, and I'm going to go ahead and put this here inside the folder, and I'm going to apply the mask. So I'm going to call this Shadows 2. So we know that that channel represents that mask. I'm going to go ahead and say that this is the edited base exposure. This is the edited over exposure. Perfect. So here we are off to a good start. Now if I just toggle this on and off, you can see that I'm starting to bring back the values that I want to bring back, but obviously I don't want any of this in the sky. So I'm going to go ahead and mask this out completely with this staying in control. I'm going to Option click on the Create New Mask button. Let's start with something simple, just a gradient ramp. And another little tip, if you see it white to black or black to white, if you hit X on the keyboard, swapping foreground to background will actually swap that. And if that doesn't happen, you can go up here and make sure that you're set to this first option, which is foreground, background. So as long as that's selected, if you hit the X key, you can actually just quickly toggle back and forth. For me, it just makes sense to always start visible and go invisible. So I know that I don't want the sky to be affected, so I'm going to go from the town about right here to here, just like that. And now I'm just going to follow up with the brush tool. So I'm going to go ahead and brush in just like this, and I'm going to use a low flow of about 10%. I'm just going to start brushing in parts of this. And actually, let's go to 20, and let's just brush that town back in, just like this. We'll keep brushing. We'll brush in the water, some of the mountain. We'll make sure we get everything that we want here in the town. Now if I take a look at this with the backslash key, you can see that I've missed a little bit of the water. So I just want to get most of that water. And we'll come in and do some more adjustments, but basically what I want to do is make sure I have the town mostly taken care of here. Now the other thing that I want to do is slowly sort of fade this into the mountain itself. So I'm going to disable that, and I'm going to use a very low flow here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that we can go ahead and isolate this area right in the center of the screen. And I'm just going to go ahead and paint this in. Now I want to fade this to the top. Now this is very difficult, because if I go over this, you can see it's going to paint the sky. And I don't want to just select the edges using a selection tool. I want to be able to quickly brush this in. So instead of doing that, we're going to do something that's completely different to try to isolate just this mountain. So I'm going to do my best to fade up to it without touching the sky, and we turn this on and off. We can see I haven't. Still have a little bit of the town here to mask in, just a hair, but I don't want to go over and hit the sky itself. So let's go ahead and do something brand new to try to isolate this mountain. First thing I'm going to do is disable these masks. And remember, to disable the masks, I'm going to go ahead and click Shift, Shift-click, and Shift-click. So I basically just want to see this intact. And that's because when I go to Channels, Channels always represents whatever is currently visible in your layer palette. So if I turn this layer off, for example, and I go back to Channels, my channels are always going to show current. So what I want to actually do is show this layer. And this is a little bit of a super user kind of technique. So we go ahead and go to Channels, and what I'm actually going to do is look for the greatest area of contrast between the sky. Now if I know that the sky is blue and this is mostly green, you can see that we have an incredible amount of contrast between that, almost like we could pull a selection, a gray selection of itself, and isolate this object. So what I'm actually going to do is duplicate the blue channel, and we want to select the mountain. So I'm going to invert it. Command-I. That looks pretty good. Now notice I have this nice gray edge around this and this perfect selection of the mountain itself. Well, let's go ahead and name this. We're going to name this Inverse Blue 1. So just like last time, I'm going to go ahead and select it, and we are going to intersect it. I'm going to create one more. Same thing, select, intersect, create another one, and you can see what's happening here. Select, intersect, do that again, intersect, there we go. So we actually have 4 levels. Now this is pretty cool. Now before I get to the explanation, let's just go ahead and name these. So Inverse Blue 2, and I'll actually copy that so that I can just go ahead and quickly put it into these channels here. So double click, paste, back that up 3, and do that right here too. Got to stay organized when we do these layers. Perfect. So let's go ahead and zoom that out and zoom it out a little bit more. So you can see this is basically the inverse of the blue. So this is the start of a selection of just the mountain. And then as we have intersected it, you can see that inverse blue 2, inverse blue 3 still has some of the sky selected. But then we have inverse blue 4. You can see we're starting to select the mountain itself. So I'm going to go ahead and save this in the background. We're going to load number 4, inverse blue 4. I'm going to go ahead and turn everything back on. I'm actually going to create a new folder with a new mask, and we're going to call this Inverse Blue 4. And I'm actually going to duplicate this layer, so Command-J, and I'm going to load this here. And I'm actually going to, let's just go ahead and wipe out the mask really quick. So I'm just going to flood it with white with Option and Delete. So we'll flood it with white. So now here, let's go ahead and retoggle our masks here, and you can see now I'm starting to lighten up the mountains. Notice how I'm lighting up the mountains here and not really messing with the sky at all. Now, it's a little bit dull at first, and I want to point something else out too, is I don't really want to do anything down here. So what I'm actually going to do is black out this mask. So instead of Option Delete, since that's my foreground color, I'm going to use Command Delete, the background color, and flood it. Now what I'm going to do is actually use the paintbrush tool, and I'm going to paint in a couple elements. Now one here, I'm actually going to paint in the mountain. So I'm going to go ahead and paint in the brightness of that mountain. And don't worry that it looks dull right now. What we're actually going to do is do the same thing here with this mountain, just like that. And you know what? Just for good measure, I'm just going to go ahead and hit Option right here. I'm going to make sure that I just go ahead and paint in the rest of the sky, because it really didn't mess with the sky at all. Sometimes it's easy to just go right into the mask like this, make sure you get everything that you want. Perfect, so now we have part of that mountain. Now that's already starting to look pretty good, but I want to take it a step further. This has been the basis, but with this selected, this is actually quite powerful because now inside of that folder, what I can actually do is create different layers. I can actually create a curves adjustment layer, and I can further color correct this to bring up the vibrance of it here. So I can basically bring it up quite a bit. I'm just going to slide it up maybe about there, and I'm going to leave it, and I'm actually going to black out this mask. And what I want to do is go ahead and paint lightly above the town. So this mountain right now is looking a little bit flat. We're going to go ahead and address that a little bit after I do this technique. Let's go ahead and make the brush size a little bit smaller. I'm going to use an incredibly low flow. Now the nice thing is as I do this, if I go over the sky itself, it's not going to matter. But as I start to paint the mountain here, you can see that I can control this brightness. So we have this curves layer. And you can see before and after. I probably want to go in here and add just a little bit more brightness right around this area. That looks pretty good for now. And I can always go in and double click this and change it and brighten it even more. So now that mountain's starting to come back to life, isolated from the sky. Overall, this is really starting to take shape. I think it's starting to look pretty good. There are still a bunch of things to do. Before we start getting into addressing the stars themselves, the next step is to fix the bottom part of this image using an earlier blue hour. So we're going to go back into Lightroom and we're going to take a look at the other image that I provide. Now remember, this is the shot basically. This is the time of night that I chose for the base shot, and we underexposed the heck out of it. So now I'm actually going to go back in time a little bit to something that's a little less intense. And you can see that this actually looks pretty good down here. It's not as yellow, it's not as late, and there's less movement. All the cars are parked, and these starbursts, they're really intense, but there's not much I can do about it. But it looks pretty good. The beach, the water, everything looks pretty nice. We just need to make a few adjustments. Let's go ahead and pull the highlights down a little bit. And let's pull the shadows up just a little bit. Something like that. I'm going to kind of use this as an example. And you can see that that's pretty close. It's a little brighter. And if I kind of keep this toggled and I go back to Photoshop, you can see that overall this is a little bit more crisp in detail, but the luminosity is about the same. And that's what I'm really looking for. I don't have to do too much to this to get this in. And let's go ahead and right-click, export, export with previous. Select all, we'll copy, we'll close it, and we'll go ahead and clean this up a little bit here. Close that down, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it. So this is going to be the early, edited, early blue hour. So you can see it's a big difference actually from what we have. It actually looks more natural. It looks really nice. So I want to use little portions of this. I'm not going to use any luminosity masking. I'm just going to go ahead and create a black mask, and we're going to manually sort of paint this in. Now the main reason that I'm bringing this in, we'll go ahead and zoom in a little bit, is this bottom area that I feel is just way too yellow. So with the mask selected, with a flow of something like, let's say 60, I am just going to start painting in this area, and you can see it transform. A lot less intense. And what I mean by intense, that yellow, that late blue hour happens with those ambient lights, everything really turns yellow. Same thing here, what I want to do is just paint in that really nice blue. You see how that blue's changing? I actually have a really pretty blue. And as I start to do that, I want to go ahead and just with 10% opacity, I'm just going to softly blend that into the blue I already have for the water. Reason being, I don't want to go up here because I don't want to change the color of that mountain. I actually just want to be soft about it, right into the water, blend it into itself. Now around here, I also want to be careful. I want to go ahead and blend this in on the rocks because I want those rocks to have the benefit of the less yellow, but I also don't want to go too much over here because I have those beautiful light trails. It's the reason that I selected that. So I'm going to be a little bit more selective with this rather than going to a different tool like a selection tool. I'm just going to go ahead and paint this in. That's really easy. I prefer to paint it soft, and again, if I miss a little bit, we can get that in color correction on a different step. So we'll just go ahead and paint this in, get that whole edge, that entire edge, this entire building, and this entire edge here. Again, I want to be careful not to get any of the street and that awesome light trail. But even here, this is going to look a little bit better down here. Just a little bit more natural. Yes, it's still yellow, but it's much less yellow. Before I go any further, let's go ahead and double check our work. And I missed a spot. It was really close, actually, on that one. And you can see that looks pretty good. It looks really natural. I don't feel like that's fading into a different color. I feel like it's all part of the same color. So I'm pretty happy with that. Now the other thing that we can do here that's pretty cool is, check this out. If I knock this mask out, see how the town seems more natural? We can go ahead and do the same thing with a low opacity, like 10%, 20% maybe. We can go into the town, and all these areas that are supposed to be white, just like this, I can go ahead and paint those back in so we can get that detail back. Now you have to be careful not to go too far because, for example, if I brush this part in, you can see that those lights will actually turn off. So I don't want to do that. I actually just want to go ahead and create some pure white. And I can create pure white where white should be. So instead of having to go in and create these colors later using hue saturation, which we are going to do a little bit as well, I am actually just going to go ahead and paint some of this clean color back into the town. So you can see here, clean color, early blue hour color. But I have to be careful because I don't want to do that here. It's going to blow it out. But if I do it here, for example, this will look pretty nice. Just a little bit. And actually it was too much. Pull it back a little bit. Now again, this is one of those things where you just have to be really careful to make it look natural. You don't want to go too far, too overboard, but a little bit, like here on this building, for example, if I just paint this in just like that, will actually go a long way. Let's back it out, and let's bring in just a little bit more in the center of the town. Here as well. Let's go ahead and bring some in here. Soften that out, soften that out. And you can always just shift-click this, and you can see what's going to happen in certain areas. Like here, I feel like that's just going to bring that back. This purple, whatever that purple is, we can just get rid of it. Back here, get rid of that blue. Very, very easily just add that early blue hour contrast before those lights started washing everything out. This isn't surgical. It's basically just artistic. I'm just going in and adding little things here and there. That looks pretty good. All right, so I have, let's go ahead and zoom this back. Now, I've brought in this star layer. Now, this is, I already have it on light. Let's go ahead and turn it on normal. I'm going to rename it. We're going to call it Stars Fade. Let's go back into the stars stacked. And let's go ahead and bring in, now it's not going to be edited, but we'll just go ahead and bring in the original one so we can see the difference. And this is going to be, oops, I don't want to do that. Let's go ahead and go in here. I'm going to paste this above, and this is going to be Stars No Fade. Included inside of the assets folder for this lesson, I've included every variation of this. I've given you guys the unedited full stars stacked. If you want to go ahead and practice cloning out all of those little things, all of those little spots and spaceships, UFOs, and alien encounters, it's up to you. But the reason I did it is I wanted to give you an option. Now, you don't have to follow along 100% with what I'm doing. You can do things a little bit different. Now, here's the problem. I like the stars fade because I think it just softens everything. They look kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, majestic. I feel like this looks very linear. And that's because we have all these hard edges. I feel like the hard edges are distracting. But, on the other hand, it's way more intense. So you see how I get way more stars if I don't have a fade. So that's going to be up to you, what you want to use. And again, it's a style choice. So that's the difference. Just bringing them in, figuring out which one you want to use. And I'd recommend doing this, taking a look at both of them before you start the cloning process, for sure. You don't want to spend hours doing two when you're only going to use one. Minimize that time. So I'm going to go ahead and toss this. We're going to use the stars fade. And again, we're going to change that to the lighten blending mode. First order of business. It's doing some nasty business to the town. So let's get rid of that. Let's go ahead and create a mask. And I'm going to leave the mask white. I'm going to zoom in here. And I'm just going to mask out anything I feel that is distracting. It's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So let's just go ahead and set that to something to 60%. And I'll just go ahead and paint all this out. I don't like those lights there. I think that they're distracting. I kind of like this little light trail that's happening back there. I'm not a fan of this one right here. And I really don't like this up here. I'm just going to get rid of that. In fact, we'll probably clone that out later, but for now we'll just leave it as is. Same thing over here. That looks horrible. So let's just go ahead and get rid of that. Really easy to just go ahead and mask some of this stuff out. And in the town, it's the same thing. This is pretty cool, actually. Let's take a look at this. While I don't like any of this, it's going to be really easy to paint this out. Take a look at the top of the church and the cathedral area here. I actually was able to bring those highlights back to that. So I'm going to leave some of those intact, and I'm just going to go through and get rid of all the negative effects here. All of this, that, all of that. But I'm going to go ahead and softly, I'm just going to take a little bit off of the church dome, a little bit off of that. Not much, just a hair, because I actually like what it's doing. Now let's go to the more tricky part. Now you can see, for one, this is the edge of the gaffer tape. If I toggle this, you can see on normal again. That's the edge of the gaffer tape. So it would help with the stars, but it also, well, it's hurting a little bit too. So let's do a couple things. This is going to take a little bit of time. First thing I want to do is balance the mountain. And in order to do that, I need to fade some of it out. So we go to fade, and again, I'm just using a soft brush, and I'm going to fade it into itself. So obviously that hard line has to disappear, and what we're going to do is just try to fade that into the top very evenly, very evenly. So basically trying to make this mountain look fairly dull. And this is now going to become sort of a balancing act. So I need to be very careful around this area, around this area. Now notice how when I overlay this, there's all this incredible detail in the mountain. And you notice how when I did this, you guys might have been asking yourselves, why does that look so flat? Well, it's because of this mask itself. And take a look at this mask. While it prevented us from selecting any of the sky, it also muted out the mountain itself. So all of that is actually detail. We're losing that detail. But that's pretty easy to get back. So remember, this is inverse blue. It's saved in channels. I can always get it back if I mess this up. So what I'm actually going to do is go back here. With this selected, what I'm actually going to do is paint white directly on this mask. So I'm going to edit this mask here, just like this. Same way. So now I can fade and balance that detail. Balance that detail, just like that. And so we'll just go ahead and bring it in. And what I can do is not only balance that detail, I can balance the lighting. And I need to back up a little bit. Again, this is going to be a really big sort of balancing act. I'm going to have to balance a few layers just to get this to work. So as I start to bring the detail back in the mountain here, you can see that looks pretty good. Bring it back up here, a little bit more up here, a little bit more up here. And then I can toggle this again. I can back off just a little bit here. Remove it. I don't want any hot spots here. And then I can take a look at the stars again. I can say, all right, that's starting to look pretty good. But I might take this and fade out just a little tiny bit more on the top. Just to bring it in, just like that. The other thing that I can do, it's important to point out, I have this curves layer. This curves layer now is a little too intense, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that down just a little bit, just to balance out this mountain. Just like that. Looks good. Looks really even, actually. Not too bad at all. I can also take this off altogether and see what I get. That looks pretty good. So, with that in mind, if I want to bring some brightness back in here too, I can go ahead and bring it on the lower part. Not too bad. All right, so now let's take a look at that. Sometimes you have to zoom out to take a look. The mountain looks balanced. The lighting looks okay on the mountain. Let's go ahead and zoom in and keep addressing some of these issues. So with astrophotography in general, there's always going to be things to clean up. Now again, if I toggle this on and off, I really don't like these elements up here. I really don't like that blown out house. I don't like this little thing. I obviously don't know what that is inside of this circle. Actually, if I just kind of lasso around this, I don't know what that is. This is a little antenna. We need to get rid of these things. So let's go ahead and do that here. First by removing it on this layer and on this layer mask. Let's go in just a little bit more. And with the brush tool again, set to black, we'll go with a really small brush here. Something about a 30% flow. We're just going to go ahead and remove this. Actually, I'm going to turn that down. We're going to go ahead and remove all of this light, this building. And I'm going to be really careful not to exceed the boundaries of the stars themselves. I don't want to remove any of the stars. I just want to remove this here, just like that. Not bad. Pretty easy. Pretty easy. All of those highlights. Pretty easy. Same thing here. I don't know what that is, but let's get rid of it. I don't know what that is, but let's go ahead and get rid of it. So it doesn't need to be there. It's distracting, especially these lights. So distracting. That looks pretty good. I'm going to turn it on and off to see if I missed anything. No, I think that looks pretty good. I don't mind the antennas being lit up. I don't mind anything else. But this now needs to be adjusted. So let's go ahead and take a look at everything we've done so far. And so far, that's looking pretty good. Let's move on to the next phase. My very favorite, image cleanup. So we'll name that image cleanup. Now let's start with the easy stuff. Let's zoom in a little bit. First thing, the easy stuff, grabbing the heel brush here, content aware. Little stones. Is there anything there? Anything down here that feels distracting? That sharp white object there is very distracting. Some of these stones might be a little distracting. Now obviously, this parking lot, yes, that's extremely distracting. But if you guys want, as a personal challenge, be my guest to try to clone out that entire parking lot and add beach. Extra points if you do. But we're going to leave it there, and I'm just going to check the water. There might be some things in the water, a couple little white spots. All these little things that need to be cleaned up and addressed. All those little things that you wish you did earlier, but unfortunately usually forget. Then we also have to go into the sky. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Now, this was something I didn't like, so we'll get rid of that. That's fine. All of that looks pretty good. Now, if I spent all that time cleaning up these layers and these star layers, why are there still spots? Well, my blue hour has stars as well. So these stars are going to align, obviously, with some of these things. For example, like this one here, this star was along that line. So I actually have to go in, and just like I did last time, I have to clean all these little things up, just like that. All manually, unfortunately. There's no way to do dust and scratches. There's no way to do this because it's just going to get rid of a bunch of stuff. So you actually have to go in and clean these up. So obviously this is much faster and much easier than the other processes when you have to do this to hundreds and thousands of things. And right now, I can actually just go through and zap out some of the worst ones. And I'll usually just pan across the sky to see some of these really bad ones. All in all, it looks pretty good. There are a few here and there, so this might not be perfect if I look through this very quickly, but I also don't want to make you guys sit through this entire process. So let's go ahead and zoom in on this one here. And let's get rid of that one. These are the big distracting ones, I think. And again, these are easy. You can do this with a clone stamp, but it's better if you just use the heel brush up here. These are easy to zap out. Again, sometimes you get lucky, and those work pretty well, and you don't have to use the clone stamp. Looks pretty good. There might be some closer to the horizon. Yes, there are a couple closer to the horizon. We'll get rid of those. And then also, this looks like a little cloud was here. We'll get rid of that, and we'll make sure that there wasn't anything else on the horizon. Well, that doesn't look bad. That doesn't bother me that much. So we're going to go ahead and zoom out. Now, let's go ahead and address some of the easier elements here. Now, this is all basically just color and light texture. Trees, for example. So I'm going to go back to the clone stamp tool, and I'm going to make this a little bit larger. I'm going to use a very low flow, 15 or 20. We'll go 20. And I'm just going to start grabbing some of this green and sort of painting it over that, because I don't like that light there. I think it's extremely distracting. So we're just going to go ahead and paint in that color. I'm also going to remove this house. And it may seem more difficult than you think, but honestly it's just a little bit of texture, and this is really dark texture, so I can get away with just painting in some of this green. In fact, this is barely texture. It barely repeats itself. So let's go ahead and just brush in some of this detail up here, and we'll just cover it with some of this color. Very easy, sort of get rid of whatever that is up there. I know it's a house, but it just doesn't look that great. I just want to clean it up. Same thing over here. I don't mind the telephone poles. We could go through and clean those up together as well. And in fact, a challenge for you guys would be to clean those up. Actually, fairly simple and fairly straightforward. We'll get rid of this one together just so you can see the process. First thing I need to do, though, is get rid of this area here. So we'll go ahead and just bring in some of this. We'll bring in some of the lush green from down here just to make it seem like there's some trees and some different life going on down there. And then we'll also bring in up here some of the darker elements. We need some darker elements here for this part of the tree, and I'm getting rid of that light burst that was happening here. So just go ahead and paint that out. Take some of this, change the color, take some of this, change the color. Pretty easy stuff, pretty straightforward. Basic color, mute texture. We can do whatever we want with it. Same thing here. We can do whatever we want with it. Part of this tree here, go ahead and make a small brush. Take that down a little bit, just like that. Bring some of that tree in, fade it in, like it's fading into the other one. Whoops, a little too much there. Let's go ahead and fade that out. Pretty simple stuff. It's just a little time consuming, but it's pretty simple. We'll just go ahead and finish it up here. And I'm not going to make it perfect. I'm going to get it close to perfect. And that looks pretty good. All right, the other thing too, something like this, that is a unfortunate sort of lighting situation that happens. So just go ahead and grab a similar color in the trees here and kind of just get rid of it. Mute it down a little bit. This probably isn't going to matter in a few minutes when we remove the distortion, but until we get to that step, we might as well clean everything up that we see. This telephone pole, if you wanted to get rid of that, very simple. Just basically grab similar color and texture here in that tree, and then in this cypress tree we can do the same thing, just like that. Same thing, color and texture. Very, very simple. So with the same technique, we could go ahead and get rid of something like this other telephone pole. Be pretty easy, but I'll leave that to you guys if you want to get rid of it yourselves. All right, the next thing is this area. So while everything else was pretty simple, this area is, I don't even know what that is. I guess there's another house there. This is I can't really tell what that is. But let's just call it an annoying object. So let's say extra removal. And the reason is for something like this, I need to go ahead and create a mask. And I'm just going to create a hard line around these trees. And I'm just basically going to use my stylus to create a selection around these trees. Very, very simple, just like that. And you know what? I'll even get rid of that fuzzy tree. Why not? Close that out, create a mask. Back to the clone stamp. Now this is going to be a little tricky because these stars aren't straight. They're actually curving, so you can't go too far away or else you'll change the arc of that. So you have to kind of be careful. So I want to make sure that I select the layer, not the mask, and go in here, line those up, and you'll see I can just quickly and easily get rid of that. Now for this kind of stuff, same thing, like we want to go ahead and get rid of those lines. We just have to be really careful, really soft with this. Same thing with this here. We want to get rid of that light disturbance. We can get rid of that light disturbance on either side just by selecting these areas, like this darker portion here, and then coming down a little bit further, and we're actually just going to have to redraw that line, just like that. Same thing up here. What about here? And we're just going to redraw those star lines because they're not straight. Same thing here, coming up here. I'm going to redraw that star line all the way to the tree line to get rid of whatever is causing that horrible glow. Same thing here, right about there. Let's go ahead and redraw those star lines. All things considered, we got off pretty easy. There's not a lot to clean up. Sometimes there's just so many random variables that can come into place here. And Lee and Patrick honestly didn't even think I was going to be able to capture stars at all. So considering we're getting close to a final composite here, that's saying something. I just want to fix that little mistake here, just by cleaning it up, just like that. The other thing too is this mask prevents me from getting past that edge, but the edge is a hard edge. So if I go up to the options here, the properties, I can just feather that a half a pixel, 0.5, just like that. That looks pretty good. Let's back that up. The next step is to remove this linear distortion from the image, but before we do that, I want to go back to Lightroom. I want to go back to the original base plate, and let's just go ahead and reset it. Reset it back so I can bring in the original unedited RAW. So we'll go ahead and export with previous. This time we'll use unique names because that's been exported before. Select all, copy, close that, and we'll bring it here, paste it, I'm just going to call this original raw. Perfect. I'm going to save in the background just in case. Now here's the next step. Manual distortion correction. Now if you're going to do this, you have to make sure that you're absolutely confident that you're not going to bring anything else into Photoshop from Lightroom. So the second I do this, it's basically going to make it impossible to line anything else up, because once I use the Command T, the transform tool, and apply it, it's done. So if I wanted to bring in another stage of blue hour, if I wanted to lengthen the car trails, if I wanted to do anything of that nature, at this point I'd have to decide before I do this next step. And if you're not sure, if you're still waiting on this file, what I like to do is I'll save one version. For example, right now, I'll save this file. It'll be Atrani stars uncorrected, and then I'll save a new version that says corrected. Just in case I make a mistake, I can go back to the original version, add more layers, and I didn't lose a bunch of work. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and select everything, drag it to the folder, and we're going to call this blended result. Perfect. Now I'm going to duplicate this folder. Now, rather than creating a single layer, I'm actually going to apply these adjustments to the entire folder, which means that everything, every single one of these masks that I've created, every single one of these luminosity masks is also going to transform. Once I do this, these channels that I've created are basically void because they do not transform with the image. So if I need to create these again, I'm going to have to do it from scratch. But in the layers, as a reference, I'll leave this one underneath, and we'll go ahead and use the transform tool, Command T on the keyboard. Actually, let's back it up a step. Before that, let's add rulers, Command R, and let's go ahead and draw some guides. So the first thing, I'm going to need some guides here, just dragging from the left to the right for the image itself, so we know our vertical lines. Obviously, the church cathedral should be straight. Now, I can't guarantee, it's an old building, I can't guarantee if it is straight, but it should be mostly straight. So let's just go ahead and add some of these in the city so we can kind of see our parallel lines. Second thing, our horizon line. Let's just go ahead and bring that right below the horizon so we can see here, and the horizon, thankfully, is right on the money. Third thing I want to do, and this will come into play in a few moments, is I want to get a sense of the scale of this town. So I'm going to drag it to the top of this, and let's just use the bottom of these rocks. So I know that between here and here is the basic size of the town. Now let's enable transform, Command T. If I hold the Command key, it's going to warp. If I hold the Shift key, it's going to lock it. If I then press the Option key, so Shift Command Option, it's going to do it on both sides. So what I'm going to do is just pull this over until that line, you see that edge on the left there, is actually becoming straight, just like that. Now, if I'm not sure if this is right, if I actually arrow over a little bit, I'll just shift arrow, see that edge? That edge that's coming into frame there, just on the left? That's pretty good. So let's go ahead and edge that back to where it was. And I think that's perfect, just like that. Now, everything is linear, but check out what happened. The town now, since I've stretched it out, has actually squashed. So what I have to do is I need to scale it. So that's where these reference lines come into place. So as I scale this up, and I'm going to lose some of the stars, that's okay. I'm going to scale it back up. You can see that I can get the top of that. I don't know why it's freaking out. Sorry about that, guys. But once I get it just about right, to be about the same size. So now, from the bottom of this line to the top of the list line, to this line, it is basically the same. And I'm just going to pull that down just a tiny, tiny little bit. So now I know that it's the right size. The reason is when you start to do that kind of distortion, when you actually pin these points out, it does squash the image. So if I didn't have a reference, I'd have to guess for the scale of the town. Now, obviously, like 10, 15%, 20%, nobody's really going to notice because it was distorted. It was actually a little bit taller because it was distorting back or distorting up. That's how distortion works. It just distorts the objects and actually changes the dimension of them. So we're trying to correct it, but we want to make sure that it's at least as close as possible. Now, bear in mind, I decided to scale up a little bit, and you can see that my horizon is almost in the exact same place. Yes, I've lost some stars, but I've also lost some of the annoying elements here on the left side of the frame, so it was kind of a plus. Now, I don't like this, so I'm also going to do just a tiny little bit of scale here, just a little tiny bit. I don't know why it's tweaking out on me here. That's okay. to get rid of that car. Just like that. And I'm going to hit enter and it's going to apply it. Wonderful. I can clear my guides by using the command and colon key here. If I use the command and quotes, I actually get the grid. So command quotes, grid, command colon, semicolon, actually show and hide guides. Command R hides rulers, so we can get rid of that as well. Now we can actually see the before and after. So we have with the distortion intact and distortion removed. So I'm going to go ahead and say, you know what? I like that, and now I can go ahead and delete the original result. Now I've been saving this in the background, so just in case we need to go back, just in case I made a mistake, what I'm actually going to do here, and obviously I've named this inside of the project file. It's not a random name, it's actually a final name, but I'm just going to go ahead and save it as a separate one, just in case. Next step, color correction and color separation. So let's go ahead and duplicate this and create a brand new fresh layer. We're going to do that with the hotkey Shift, Option, Command, E, and I'll go ahead and name this now. This is going to be Adobe Camera Raw Filter, abbreviated. Perfect. So I can go up here, Filter, and Camera Raw Filter. First things first, I feel that this is overall underexposed, so I'm going to bring the exposure up just a little bit. And when I brought the exposure up, now I have to take care of the highlights. So I'm going to bring down the highlights a little bit as well. Something around, let's say, -25. And just to make it a little easier, we'll say 25. Let's bring the shadows up a little bit to compensate too. Just a little tiny bit. Actually, let's mirror it. I'm liking these even mirrored numbers. The next thing I want to do is just add a little bit of contrast. And you can see that as I pull that contrast, when you pull highlights down and you pull shadows up, you actually lose a little bit of contrast. So let's just add a little bit of contrast right back in. And remember that dehaze here in the effects. Let's see what happens when we use that. I'm not exactly sure if I'm going to like it, but it actually does. It adds some deep contrast and actually pops the stars out a little bit. I think somewhere between 5 and 10 would be good. Let's settle on 8. And I'm going to go back to the original. The next step, I actually want to create some selective adjustments. The first thing I want to do is address the warmth of the bottom of the image. So let's do that with a gradient filter from about here to here, and we can adjust it in a minute. I'm going to reset it. And what I want to do, the first thing I want to do is just toggle the highlights. See, I think I overdid it on the highlights a little bit, so let's just go ahead and shrink this down just a little bit. And again, if I hold Shift, I can lock that in. So let's just adjust the highlights a little bit more, pull them down just a little bit like this. And you know what? I also want to mitigate some of this yellow by changing the temperature. All I have to do is just change the temperature just like this. And a little bit. See how a little bit goes a long way? Just about 10%, minus 10%, and we actually start to cool down this image. Let's go ahead and fade it in just a little bit because I really want it to be just the bottom of this image. Onto the same train of thought, let's do one for the sky itself. This one's going to be a little bit more tricky. First thing, I'm going to reset it. Now, I don't want to use any dehaze, but what I want to do is try to pump the highlights up a little bit. And if I start to change the highlights here, you can see it's actually going to create sort of a gradient fall off. So it looks pretty good, but I have to decide exactly where I want this to start and where I want this to fall off. So somewhere around here I think would look pretty good. And I probably want that to be right about at the top of the mountain. And you know what? We'll go all the way up to about the top of the sky. I want this to be a nice, even fall off. And you can see as I change the highlights, it's popping those stars out. So let's pop those stars out even more, just like that. Maybe a hair more contrast in the sky itself. And that's looking pretty good. Let's go back to the main results. So here we can probably just add just a little bit more contrast. I'm going to make sure nothing's really blown out. Everything looks pretty good. If we wanted to cool this down a little bit more, or we wanted to warm this area up, we could do that as well. Like, for example, we could create an elliptical selection here. Really, really easy one, right around here. We actually want the effect to be inside. So you can see here I can actually warm this up just a little bit. Really easy. And actually, if I pull this down and scale it, Really easy to do. It doesn't have to be super perfect. It just has to be enough to sort of cool that down. And again, I can tint it. You can see if I tint it, make it a little bit, let's say, more towards the magenta, it'll look pretty nice and just a little bit less cool like it did, just to unify that color. And that looks pretty good. Actually, I like it a lot. Looks great. Let's go back here and apply the result. Toggle this on and off, and you can see before and after. And now we're really starting to pump that contrast. Next thing I want to do is I want to identify some of the color cast. Notice this blue color cast we have in the stones, and also some of the yellow color cast. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to the selective adjustments here. We're going to create one hue saturation layer, and we're going to select the blues. It's going to be a broad selection of the blues, so I can go ahead and expand that channel. Now I have to decide if I want to lighten them or I want to darken them. So in this case, I think I want to lighten them. And I'm going to lighten them up a little bit, and I'm going to drop the saturation. And of course, I'm going to black out this filter. So I'm just going to invert it there. And I'm going to zoom in. As usual, the easiest answer is the paintbrush with a small opacity, actually flow in this case, of 20. I can go ahead and remove this blue color, all this blue color cast. Now obviously I don't want to remove any of the blue in the water, so I probably want to go in something like this with the lasso tool, just like this. Actually, you know what, let's zoom in a hair just to make sure we get it just right. We're going to use the lasso tool, let's get it just right. Just around here. I'm going to hold Option to lock that down. Perfect, and I'm just going to go ahead and flood that with white. And it has an edge that's fine. Let's just go ahead and fade that edge out into these rocks, into the beach, into the sand, and into this area right there. Now the other thing that's nice, all of these masks, if you just go to the properties here, this properties window, you can just change it, and again, we can just feather this. Even though I'm painting on it, I can still feather it about half a pixel, and it'll look right. You can see that edge looks pretty good. Back it off just a little bit more, and let's just go ahead and mitigate that. Now this time I'm not going to add any warmth like I did in the last lesson. I'm actually just going to remove the blue. Remove the blue. This is fine. Remove it from the shadows here. Remove it from the beach as much as possible. Let's clean that up if we can. I know that boat's supposed to be blue, but I'm going to remove it. This building, remove, remove, remove. So we're just removing that blue. Especially over here, you can see that that's just going to bring that to life. These shadows should be shadows, just not blue shadows. Now this green, we can also adjust. In this case, I'm just going to leave it. I will send a letter to whoever lives there asking them to please change their lighting. We can actually send them a photographer's petition or something. Make it more beautiful for photographers. Only use clean cathode lighting. None of this green stuff. I mean, seriously, what is that? It's wild. All right, so we're going to name this Blue Reduction. Now let's mitigate some yellows. Fun stuff. Okay, hue saturation, same thing. Same school of thought. This time we're going to add, you know what, yellows or reds. They're very close to each other. In fact, we'll do the whole thing. This time I'm going to pull the lightness down here, and also, whoops, pull the lightness down, and also the saturation down. Perfect. It's exactly what I want. I have to invert this mask to black it out. Now what I'm going to do is sort of chisel out some of these details. See where that's yellow? It's kind of getting blobby, all sort of the same tone of yellow. This is where I can start to remove it selectively. So just in these little arches here, I can go ahead and remove the yellow. See how that's cleaning that up? Looks pretty good. We can just go ahead and clean up that color. Clean it up a little bit. I can do this with a brush because it can overlap just a little bit. Even that light there. Now this is fun too because now I can take a lower flow and I can actually remove some of that yellow cast. I'll zoom this out. I can actually remove a little bit of that yellow color cast here on the street. Of course, that yellow color cast on this building to clean it up. And just a little tiny bit over here. Not too much. Even in here, I want to be careful. I just want to remove a little bit just so it's not as intense. Same thing on these buildings. I can clean them up a little bit more. I don't want to get rid of that yellow light, but this here I could actually start to pull some of that out and maintain a little bit more of the clarity of these buildings. The blue's gone. Maybe here we remove a little bit of the yellow. Maybe down here, you know, that's just a little too intense for my taste. Here too, we can just pull that out. So this is completely custom up to you guys. Same thing with the bridge area here. We can actually take a little bit of that down. And what this is doing is it's just creating a little bit of color separation here. I can remove it from that little pool, remove it here, and even from these trees. Just kind of pull that saturation down and make it less distracting. And again, it's just subject to taste, just a little bit here and there. That's looking pretty good, but I feel it needs more overall contrast. So inside of the channels here, I'm going to leave all these channels. We've created all these, but you can see that they are distorted, so they no longer line up with the RGB. So what I'm actually going to do now is create a mid-tone mask. Since we've already gone over how to select and deselect masks and also how to intersect them, this is going to be really easy. I'm going to create a brand new mask of RGB, so a brand new channel here. So I have alpha 1, and we're just going to go ahead and call this right now. We'll name it highlights. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it with a Command-I and invert it, and I'm going to call this shadows. So let's say we had a selection of everything. Command-All, we'd use that, Command-A. And let's say we subtracted the shadows. What would we get? Well, let's see. We'd actually get the highlights. Well, that doesn't really help us. But what if we selected everything, we subtracted the shadows and the highlights? Well, it's going to say that nothing is visible, so it can't show the crawling ants. That's fine. I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to create a new mask. So check this out. We have highlights, shadows, and now the removal of both highlights and shadows has left the midtones. So now the midtones. So this actually protects the shadows, protects the highlights, and just affects the midtones of the image, the pure midtones. So let's name this midtones. This is pretty cool. We're going to select it. It's going to give me that same error. No problem. Select RGB. I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to name it midtones. Apply the mask, and you can see that even though it doesn't show the selection, it still applies the mask, so it's no problem. Let's add a curves layer. Now remember, this protects the shadows and the highlights. So it's basically just going to add contrast or brightness in those midtones, and it's going to leave the highlights and shadows in place. So it's a way that you can add something that simulates something like a Nik collection or On1 or any kind of pro contrast plugin. This gives you the ability to just go in and say, you know what, I want to protect all of my tones and light and darks, but I want to go ahead and adjust the overall boost of those midtones, and you can see I can do that. And I can actually lock them down as well. I can say, you know what, I want to isolate that. I only want to be messing with the midtones associated with this part of the image, but I don't want to mess with the highlights. And you can see what I can do there. And that's pretty nice. So let's go ahead and give it a nice little boost here. And you can see that that gives it a nice little boost in overall luminance. And we're just going to call this boost. And I'm going to create another curves. Let's do another one. So that's a boost. But what if I want to add deep contrast? Well, since there's midtones involved, I can actually bring those midtones down closer to black, almost start to bring them to where I kind of crush the midtones into the black, and I can also crush the midtones into the highlights. So if I do that, I can actually create a small little S-curve. So I bring this down, it darkens that up. But if I bring it up here, I can create a small little S-curve. And what this is a midtones contrast layer. So this gives you super contrast at the end. And again, you have to be really careful you don't take this too far. But if you take it just right, you can get a really nice result from here to here. So that gives some nice contrast. So we're going to call this contrast. That looks really good. I'm just going to change the order of this just to clean it up. Next thing that I want to do is actually go ahead and address the high pass filter because we haven't done any sharpening. Let's go ahead and duplicate the layer, go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. 2.5 has been working. Let's go with what's worked so far. Change it to Overlay. And I'm going to zoom in super sharp now. Too sharp, in my opinion. And let's see, let's back it up just a little bit. Too sharp in my opinion. So I'm going to go ahead and bring this overlay into a soft light, and that's going to soften it a little bit. And I'm also going to take the opacity down to about 60 to 80%, just so that I can see this on. You can see it sharpening a little bit, maybe a little bit more, and we can see that result. So I want some sharpening, but not too much. The other thing is I want selective sharpening. So let's go ahead and create a black mask, Alt-click. I'm going to zoom out, and I'm going to go ahead and brush in just the town. And not only just the town, just the interesting part of the town. So if you see what I'm brushing in, it's not very much, just a little bit. I just want this little bit of the town to really pop. I don't really care about too much of this other detail down here. I don't want people to think that's razor sharp. I'd just rather them honestly ignore the big parking lot there. Focus on the beautiful town. Maybe we get a little bit of sharpening up here just to bring that back in to the realm of a sharp and detailed image. With the sharpening done, I'm actually going to call this one pretty much complete. Now remember, these midtones are actually making quite a bit of difference. So if you feel like you've over-contrasted it, if I can even say over-contrasted, made it too contrasty, you can boost it a little bit more. You can see you can boost this. Or if you think you've boosted it too much, you can just go in and make these tiny, tiny little adjustments. These micro adjustments are always the hardest to get right. You want to make sure that these last things are important. So for example, let's just say my blue reduction here. You can see it's pretty dramatic, but it works pretty well. Maybe I don't want to remove it here. Maybe I want that blue color. I can put it back. Same thing with the hue saturation here that I need to name. We'll call it yellow reduction. Same thing with the yellow reduction. We can just turn it on and off and see if I went too far. Now, if you feel like you went too far, you can go back into the settings themselves here, make those changes, or you can roll back the overall opacity. That's totally up to you. So I can take the opacity maybe down to 85%. Toggling that on and off, I think that's a little bit better. I don't want to remove all the yellow. I want there to be some believability. If you remove all of the bounce light, all of the blue, all of the yellow, then it looks a little bit too plain and kind of monochromatic. So you have to be careful about that. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we've done so far. I'm going to go ahead and expand this. I'm going to scroll down. We've done quite a bit. There are a lot of layers. There is a lot going on here. So let's go ahead and take a look at our final before and after. So we started here with the original RAW. We're going to go ahead and enable that here. From the original RAW, we went ahead and edited the base exposure from here to here. We added the shadow layer in, and then what we did is we balanced those shadows and brought in an early blue hour, and then we brought the stars in and did some cleanup. After that, we just did those color corrections, and we took it from here to here. So small differences between there. So if we look at them sort of step by step, it's not as dramatic, but let's go ahead and take a look at it from start to finish. The original RAW and the final edited result. Now that is a huge difference from before and after. Well, that wraps things up for Atrani and these star trails. This, I think, has been one of the most complex files I've ever edited in all of photographing the world. Now, that being said, I actually used some simplified techniques, so we really didn't have to draw any hard masks or do any kind of crazy selections. Everything was there for us in the channels. I just found creative ways that we could kind of use the blue channel in order to isolate the elements and then blend them together. So sometimes it's sort of a complicated answer that makes things easier, but in the end, when you actually think about the techniques that you're using, you can save yourself hours of time, because if I would have had to paint the edge of these trees and the mountain, I would have driven not only myself, but you guys insane as well. So we're going to call this one done, and we're going to be traveling to another beautiful little town in Italy, and the next time I see you guys, we'll be back in the field.